Since September 11, 2012, an abundance of false and misleading conspiracy theories have been thrown around concerning what happened in Benghazi, Libya. On that day, Mitt Romney and a treasonous cabal operating within the Republican Party for nearly 50 years orchestrated their Benghazi surprise. The treasonous acts of Mitt Romney and the Republican cabal resulted in the deaths of U.S. Ambassador to Libya Chris Stevens, U.S. Information Officer Sean Smith, and 2 U.S. security personnel, Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods. That Republican cabal has a long history of treasonous and criminal acts to win presidential elections. Treasonous acts of collaborating with enemy nations. Treasonous acts of collaborating with terrorists. Treasonous acts of collaborating with kidnappers and hostage takers. And treasonous acts of making illegal arms and weapons deals with enemy nations. Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, and the Republican cabal had the means, the motive, and the opportunity to perpetrate the terrorist assault on the U.S. consulate and CIA compound that resulted in the murder of 4 Americans in Benghazi. First, let's examine the long history of treasonous acts by the cabal within the Republican Party. In 1968, Richard Nixon was fearful that peace talks would successfully end the Vietnam War before the presidential election. Nixon believed that peace in Vietnam would influence voters and that Nixon would lose the presidential election. To prevent peace in Vietnam, Richard Nixon resorted to the Saigon Surprise, a series of treasonous acts to sabotage peace talks to end the Vietnam War. In a recently declassified recording of a telephone conversation between President Lyndon Johnson and Republican Senator Everett Dirksen, President Johnson explains how Richard Nixon had traitorously interfered in those peace talks.
Yeah, and here's the latest information we got. The agent says that they just talked to the boss in New Mexico, and that he says that you must hold out, that just hold on until after the election. Yeah. Or some of our folks, including some of the old China lobby, are going to the Vietnamese embassy and saying, please notify the president that if he'll hold out till November the 2nd, they could get a better deal. Now, I'm reading their hand, Everett. I don't want to get this in the campaign. Okay. And they ought to be doing this. This is treason. I know. Now, I can identify them because I know who's doing this. I don't want to identify it. I think it would shock America if a principal candidate was playing with a source like this on a matter this important. Yeah. I don't want to do that. Yeah. But if they're going to put this kind of stuff out, they ought to know that we know what they're doing. I know who they're talking to, and I know what they're saying. Yeah. Yeah. Now, if Nixon keeps the South Vietnamese away from the conference, yeah, well, that's going to be his responsibility. Up to this point, that's why they're not there. Yeah. I had them signed on board until this happened. Yeah. Now, you see, I know what Q says to his people out there. Yeah. I haven't seen Laird. Well, I don't know who it is that's with Nixon. It may be Laird, it may be Harlow, it may be Mitchell. I don't know who it is. I know this, that they're contacting a foreign power in the middle of a war. It's a mistake. And it's a damn bad mistake. Oh, it is. Now, I don't want to say so. And you're the only man to have enough confidence in to tell them. But you better tell them they better quit playing with it. Well, you just tell them that their people are messing around in this thing. If they don't want it on the front pages, they better quit it, number one. Number two, we better sit down and talk about it as soon as this thing's over with, and we'll try to work out and they ought to tell their people that are contacting these embassies to go on with the conference.
Richard Nixon won the presidency in 1968, and Nixon's treasonous acts prevented the end of the Vietnam War. The continuation of the Vietnam War for 7 years resulted in the loss of 21,257 American lives. That is 36% of the names on the Vietnam Wall in Washington, D.C. President Richard Nixon's treasonous acts won him the presidency, and our nation lost the Vietnam War. Next we come to the presidential election of 1980, when Ronald Reagan and the Republican cabal perpetrated the October surprise to defeat President Jimmy Carter and put Reagan in the White House. On November 4, 1979, the U.S. Embassy in Tehran, Iran was invaded by terrorists, and 56 Americans were taken hostage. Reagan feared that President Jimmy Carter would be re-elected if President Carter could secure the release of the hostages before the presidential election in 1980. In September of 1980, the Iran-Iraq War started. Ronald Reagan and his treasonous Republican cabal perpetrated the October surprise to prevent the release of the American hostages until after the election. George H.W. Bush and William Casey met in Paris with representatives of the Iranian government to broker a deal to keep the hostages in Iran until Reagan was sworn into office as president. The treasonous Republican cabal supplied the weapons to Iran by using the Israelis to deliver the weaponry and arms supplies. Iran received its secret and illegal arms shipments from the Israelis, and the American hostages were held by the Iranian terrorists until after the 1980 election. 30 minutes after Ronald Reagan was inaugurated as president, the American hostages were released by the Iranians. The hostages reported that the Iranian terrorists literally counted down the minutes on their wristwatches. The 1980 October surprise with President Ronald Reagan's illegal and treasonous weapons and hostages deal with Iran was so successful that Reagan and the treasonous Republican cabal perpetrated a similarly illegal and treasonous arms deal with Iran in 1985. The country of Lebanon had been in a state of civil war for several years before an international peacekeeping force entered the country in 1982. The terrorist group, the Hezbollah militia, set off bombs totaling 12,000 pounds of TNT to destroy the U.S. Marine Corps barracks in Beirut in October 1983. 241 American servicemen were killed in the explosion. 220 Marines, 18 Navy sailors, and 3 Army soldiers. President Reagan pulled our military forces out of Lebanon. The Hezbollah militia then kidnapped 7 Americans, including William Francis Buckley, the CIA station chief in Beirut, Lebanon. Buckley had been in the CIA more than 20 years and, ironically, was involved in the Reagan's October surprise meetings with Iranian officials in Paris, France, in 1980. President Reagan and the treasonous Republican cabal decided to illegally sell weapons to Iran again, in order for the Hezbollah militia to release the American hostages. This was similar to the illegal and treasonous scheme, the October surprise of 1980, that put Reagan in the White House and kept hostages in Iran until Reagan's inauguration. 508 TOW missiles and Hawk missiles were sold to Iran, with Israel delivering the illegal arms shipment again. All of the American hostages were released, but William Francis Buckley was tortured and killed while in confinement by the terrorists. President Reagan and the treasonous Republican cabal had been partially successful, but this arms for hostages deal with Iran was discovered, along with a plan to illegally funnel money to the Contra guerrillas in Nicaragua. It became known as the Iran-Contra affair. President Reagan's Secretary of Defense, Caspar Weinberger, and several other Reagan staff members were indicted for crimes committed in the Iran-Contra affair. Several of the staff members were convicted of crimes and were then pardoned by President George H.W. Bush. President George H.W. Bush was defeated in the 1992 election by Bill Clinton, but George H.W. Bush and 2 of his sons would seek revenge. In the 1980 election, it took 3 of the treasonous Bush family members and the Republican cabal to pull off the Florida Sunshine surprise. Prior to the 1980 presidential election, Republican Florida Governor Jeb Bush and his Republican Secretary of State Katherine Harris eliminated 57,700 supposed felons from Florida's list of registered voters. That represented 1% of the total registered voters and 3% of the total African American registered voters in the state of Florida. The Jeb Bush list was found to be 5% accurate and 95% inaccurate. That treasonous Jeb Bush list was used to prevent thousands of qualified voters from voting in the presidential election in Florida. President Clinton's vice president, Al Gore, won the popular vote across the nation by more than 500,000 votes. But the Electoral College total was won by George W. Bush due to the treasonous activities of his brother, Jeb Bush, denying thousands of qualified voters the ability to vote in Florida. On September 11, 2001, Al-Qaeda terrorists hijacked 4 passenger jets in the United States. 2 of the passenger jets were deliberately crashed into the Twin Towers in New York City. 1 passenger jet was crashed into the Pentagon in Washington, D.C., and 1 passenger jet crashed when the passengers fought the terrorists. 2,997 people were killed by the Al-Qaeda terrorists in the 9/11 attacks. Osama bin Laden, the leader of Al-Qaeda, masterminded the attacks and took credit for the actions of the terrorists. In less than 3 months, Osama bin Laden was cornered in the Tora Bora region of Afghanistan. The American CIA requested 600 troops to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. On December 14, Osama bin Laden wrote his will and expected to be killed rather than surrender. The Secretary of Defense, Donald Rumsfeld, and General Tommy Franks refused to supply additional American troops to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. The American troops, willing and available to kill or capture Osama bin Laden, were ordered to stand down. On December 16, 2 days after writing his will, Osama bin Laden walked out of Tora Bora with his entourage, with no opposition or interference. Osama bin Laden was the mastermind behind the 9/11 terrorist attacks and murdered 2,997 people. And what did Vice President Dick Cheney have to say about letting Osama bin Laden escape? Vice President Dick Cheney said that Osama bin Laden's location was uncertain. On May 2, 2011, 3,424 days, or 9 years, 4 months, 16 days, after Osama bin Laden walked out of Tora Bora, President Barack Hussein Obama was certain, very certain, that Osama bin Laden was dead, with no uncertainty whatsoever, very certainly dead. On September 11, 2012, Mitt Romney and the Republican treasonous cabal orchestrated their Benghazi 9/11 surprise in a desperate attempt to put Mitt Romney in the White House. As you have seen and heard, in the nearly 50-year history of illegal and treasonous activities by the Republican cabal, that history clearly shows that the Republican cabal has the means to commit illegal and treasonous acts to win elections, commit illegal and treasonous acts of collaborating with enemy nations, commit illegal and treasonous acts of collaborating with terrorists, commit illegal and treasonous acts of making arms deals with enemy nations, commit illegal and treasonous acts of collaborating with kidnappers and hostage takers. Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, and the Republican cabal had one clear motive for the Benghazi 9/11 surprise. That motive was desperation to put Romney in the White House. In September 2012, with 2 months to go until the election, Mitt Romney was trailing President Obama badly in the polls and was extremely desperate. Mitt Romney explains why he is desperate in a private meeting with Republican supporters.
There are 47% of the people who will vote for the president no matter what. I mean, the president starts off with 48, 49, 40, he starts off with a huge number.
Mitt Romney claimed that President Obama had 48 or 49%. It is obvious that Romney is correct because President Obama was at 48.7% in the polls, 4 percentage points ahead of Romney.
I mean, the president starts off with 48, 49, 40, he starts off with a huge number.
Mitt Romney clearly could not win the presidential election. The motive for Romney's Benghazi 9/11 surprise was a very desperate attempt to eliminate President Obama's commanding lead before the election. Mitt Romney and the corrupt and treasonous Republican cabal needed a game-changing event to defeat President Obama and put Mitt Romney in the White House. The Republican cabal had to use the opportunity of skills gained in past treasonous, illegal and corrupt activities to win presidential elections for Richard Nixon in 1968, for Ronald Reagan in 1980, and for George W. Bush in the year 2000. The Republican cabal could not sabotage peace talks while in a war, like the Saigon surprise. President Obama had too much of a lead for a Florida Sunshine surprise to work. Mitt Romney, Paul Ryan, and the Republican cabal needed a hostage situation, like the October surprise in 1980, to put Mitt Romney in the White House. The Republican cabal wanted hostages from a U.S. embassy to repeat the October surprise. Mitt Romney and the treasonous Republican cabal chose Libya for the kidnapping of Americans because it was an unstable country following the Libyan civil war. September 11th was chosen for the date of Romney's 9/11 surprise to heighten patriotic fervor. The treasonous Republican cabal pulled out an old trick to include the idea of an arms deal in the kidnapping plot. Romney and the Republican cabal lured U.S. Ambassador to Libya, Chris Stevens, from Tripoli to Benghazi with a meeting about a proposed arms deal. The Benghazi consulate was known to have minimal security and a history of terrorist attacks. Vice President Cheney was uncertain of how to locate Osama bin Laden, but Cheney and the Republican cabal were certain of locating terrorists to kidnap Stevens and others in Benghazi. The treasonous Republican cabal used contacts and favors owed by terrorists for allowing Osama bin Laden to walk out of Tora Bora in 2001. Rumsfeld and Franks used treasonous Republican contacts within the military to assure that rapid response teams in Europe were diverted on training missions to prevent a U.S. military response to Romney's Benghazi 9/11 surprise, in a similar manner to the treasonous actions taken to allow Osama bin Laden to escape in Bush's Tora Bora surprise. Terrorists working for the Republican treasonous cabal attacked the Benghazi consulate compound on September 11, 2012. Stevens and a few other Americans retreated to a safe building. The terrorists then set the building on fire to smoke out the Americans and take them hostage. Some of the Americans escaped the building, but Ambassador Christopher Stevens and an embassy staff member, Sean Smith, were overcome by smoke. Sean Smith was killed by smoke inhalation, but Ambassador Stevens was still alive when removed from the building by terrorists. The terrorists working for the Romney Benghazi 9/11 surprise celebrated when they found that Stevens, their hostage, was alive. Ambassador Stevens was taken to a Benghazi hospital controlled by a terrorist group. The terrorists then attacked the CIA compound in Benghazi through the night in an effort to kidnap more Americans. While the Americans at the CIA compound fought off the terrorists through the night, Mitt Romney issued a statement acknowledging the death of Sean Smith. It is clear from the statement that Romney believed that Ambassador Stevens had been successfully taken hostage. Romney was elated that his Benghazi 9/11 surprise terrorists had a hostage. Ambassador Christopher Stevens did not make it through the night at the hospital. Glenn Doherty and Tyrone Woods successfully held off the terrorists through the night, but were killed by a single mortar blast while manning a machine gun on a building roof. The terrorists retreated at daylight. 28 Americans were evacuated from Benghazi. The treasonous attempt to create Mitt Romney's Benghazi 9/11 surprise had failed.